Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the presence of the past. We're going to look at the difference between the evolutionary concept of the development of the universe and the laws of nature as opposed to the notion that the laws of nature are eternal. With me is Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, a biologist trained at Harvard and Cambridge universities. Dr. Sheldrake is the author of A New Science of Life, The Hypothesis of Formative Causation, a book which has stirred a ripple of controversy throughout the scientific community, and more recently he has authored a book called The Presence of the Past. Welcome, Rupert. It's a pleasure to have you here. Typically, scientists have basically viewed the universe almost from a mystical or metaphysical perspective when they seem to insist that the basic laws of physics, the forces, the laws of gravitation, relativity, quantum theory, and so on, are somehow eternal, that they stand in effect outside of time and space.
This is the way that science has historically developed, and the tradition that it's rooted in goes right back to ancient Greece, to Plato and Pythagoras. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, when modern science was getting going, most of the great scientists, Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, all believed that there was an eternal transcendent realm of mathematical laws or mathematical realities. They thought, in fact, that God was a mathematician, and that these were ideas in the mind of God, and that these eternal mathematical realities were the laws of nature. And the laws of nature existed within this mind of God, which of course transcended time and space. So they had a kind of theology, which was the other side of the coin of their mechanistic theory of nature. The world was a machine, but it was governed by eternal laws which were maintained and existing in God's mind.
Well, it's both ironic and compelling, I suppose. Ironic in the sense that scientists today pride themselves on being strictly empiricists and shunning metaphysics, and yet compelling in the sense that, well, surely 1 and 1 does equal 2. That seems to be a reality quite independent of anything in the physical world.
There's a sense in which some of the truths of mathematics are strangely eternal. But there's a difference between 1 and 1 equaling 2 and, say, Schrödinger's equation of quantum mechanics being an eternal reality. And what scientists have come to think of is that the laws of nature, originally conceived of as God's ideas, exist quite independently. And of course many scientists are atheists, and so they've got rid of the idea of God. But these eternal laws, which were originally ideas in God's mind, still survive as an implicit assumption in science.
Well, I suppose if you go back to ancient cosmologies, I'm thinking of the Hindu cosmology, for example, wasn't there the notion that the laws of Manu, the laws of the universe, stood above the gods, above the various deities, that even the deities themselves were subject to these universal laws?
Yes, I think the idea of laws, eternal laws, is rooted in quite a lot of ancient civilizations. And it's part of the archaic or ancient mode of seeing the world, which was essentially one that went on eternally, in eternal cycles. You see, the Hindus had the idea that the universe is created and then it's dissolved again and created again. There were cycles of universes, of worlds, and these cycles were like great breaths of Brahma. These were huge astronomical cycles. The Greeks thought again in terms of cycles. They had an eternal view of the universe, and eternal laws made sense in the context of an eternal universe, or at least of one that was eternally destroyed and recreated.
I would imagine most scientists might be a little bit embarrassed when you point out to them that the concept that they have of these eternal laws is really not founded on any kind of empirical logic, but is in fact metaphysical.
Well, most of them find it hard to admit or hard to recognize. And they try to wriggle out of it by saying that, well, these laws are just things, temporary hypotheses and so on. But actually they really believe that the laws are eternal. And this is built into the scientific method as we know it, because science as we know it is based on the idea that any experiment should be reproducible or repeatable by anyone competent enough to do the experiment, anywhere at any time. And the reason why scientific experiments should be completely repeatable anywhere at any time is because the laws of nature are assumed to be the same at all times and in all places. And so the very scientific method as we know it depends on this assumption.
But in your hypothesis of formative causation and the notion of morphic fields, which you've developed, Rupert, there is a totally different paradigm, a totally different vision of the universe and the laws of nature itself. It's as if these laws aren't eternal at all. They're the product of evolution, and even our thoughts about them are the product of evolution.
Yes, and I think the reason why we can think of them in an evolutionary way is that we now have an evolutionary cosmology. After more than 2,000 years in Western thought of the universe being thought of as essentially eternal, or at least if created by God in the beginning, then going on indefinitely thereafter, we now have the idea of the universe as an evolutionary system, starting with the Big Bang, and the idea that it's been growing and evolving ever since. So the idea that it's governed by eternal laws doesn't really make sense, and I would suggest that instead of it all having a kind of Napoleonic code established at the outset, that if there are laws of nature, then they've evolved just as the laws of the United States have evolved, or the laws of England have evolved over time.
The way physicists tend to look at this now, is, according to some physicists I've spoken to, is that if you look at, say, the first billionth of a second after the Big Bang, the laws that we now experience and the properties of the universe didn't exist at all. The universe was structured quite differently, and then even during the first second, things changed quite rapidly.
Well, this is the effect of physics taking evolution seriously. And you see, until 1966, physics held out against evolution, which had become the dominant idea in the human sciences and the life sciences. They still went on believing the universe was eternal. They were the last people to take up this evolutionary idea. And we forget how recent this is. Most of our education, most of our thinking was shaped under the aspect of a much older and much more classical paradigm.
Yeah. So you seem to be suggesting that as the universe itself evolved from the Big Bang, it formed habits, it developed patterns which have remained, but these patterns in themselves were somewhat arbitrary. It could have been otherwise.
Yes, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't have been otherwise. And this is true of any evolutionary process, isn't it? I mean, the English language is an evolutionary system. It's evolved. We have words for things, like the word word itself. Well, other languages get on perfectly well using different words for the word word. We could have used other words for words we now have. They could have been otherwise. And we know from the evolution of other languages you can do these things in many different ways. Yet, for some reason, these particular words became established, and the evolution of our language has made some of them deeply habitual.
Well, if we go back to the origins of the universe itself, to the Big Bang, which is sort of a good starting point, there's a sense in which all of this matter and energy and biological evolution evolved, in effect, out of nothing.
Well, that's the theory, you see, and I think really when we get back to these questions of the origin of the universe, we're dealing with the creation, we're dealing really with the realm of creation myths, what in most cultures are called myths of creation, the stories of the origins of everything. In a scientific society, we have to have, as it were, a scientific creation myth. Of course, we don't know what happened at the beginning. We have to make it up in a sense, and it has to be plausible and consistent with what we know. But the fact that theories come and go in the realm of cosmology with such alarming speed Now it's a 10-dimensional universe to start with, and the primal field in 1985, it was an 11-dimensional one. There have been periods when it's had several hundred dimensions. These theories come and go. They're attempts to conceive of the origins of things, how the many arise from the one. And this is, of course, a very traditional theme in metaphysics.
Mm-hmm. So what you're suggesting is that just, I suppose, as a young child grows up and forms habits and learns language, so did the universe
Yes,
itself.
I think if we think of the universe as an organism, and the idea of the Big Bang is very like those ancient myths of the cracking of the cosmic egg. If we think of the universe as an organism developing from the original creative event, growing just like organisms grow, as trees and animals and plants grow, as their embryos, and then they get bigger and they form structures within them. The universe on the present model looks much more like a developing organism than it does like an eternal machine, which was the primary metaphor of the mechanistic worldview. I mean, it's barely recognizable. The old universe we were brought up with was an eternal machine that was gradually running out of steam, heading towards a thermodynamic heat death. Well, we don't hear much about that anymore. The universe is now like this growing organism, which has new things are constantly happening within it. And I think that just as an organism develops habits as it grows up, this seems a more plausible metaphor for the universe than the idea of laws imposed from the outside.
Well, we know that organisms develop habits. We know that we all have habits, and yet you seem to be asking us to look more carefully at our use of language and not just to take things for granted like habits. You seem to be questioning the very notion, as far as I can tell, of time itself.
Yes, and I think that the idea of habit, you see, when we generalize it, which other people have done before, C.S. Peirce, the American philosopher, thought of the habits of nature a century ago.
Yes.
Samuel Butler, the English writer, thought about them. When we generalize the idea of habit, we can see that something we know from our own experience may help us understand what's going on in the universe. Just as the idea of law, the traditional idea in science, is based primarily on a human experience, the experience of human laws made up by kings, constitutional governments, emperors, and so on.
But the notion of a habit, or even the notion of a law, but particularly the notion of a habit, implies that somehow the past is alive within us. Even though moment by moment we experience ourselves always to be in the now moment, we carry the past somehow.
Exactly, and the past shapes and conditions the way we are in the now. The very fact that you and I are speaking English is based on a whole process of learning of English, and the language we speak has itself evolved and built up habits which are greater than you or me. We inherit these linguistic habits.
And you seem to be suggesting, if I can jump ahead a bit, that the conventional notions that we have, that the presence of the past within us is sort of locked into our nerve synapses or coded into various molecules that are stored in the brain, that somehow that in itself is also an unproven assumption that scientists hold, and quite possibly an erroneous assumption.
I think it is an erroneous assumption. And the way that science thinks of the world right now is traditionally and conventionally is that it's made up of material systems, energy, particles, matter, and the known fields of physics, which are governed by eternal laws. And what happens now depends on the way these material systems are right now. Memory traces in the brain, for example, as physical records of what's happened. And that the universe is essentially amnesic. The entire past is completely forgotten, except insofar as it's retained in some physical trace, like a tape recording or a written record or a trace in the brain. And I think it may be quite different from that. It may be that there's an inherent memory in the whole of nature, that memory is inherent in everything, and that as the universe grows and develops, these memories, through repetition, become increasingly habitual.
Well, there is a sense in Oriental traditions that the past is alive, and I think even in modern physics, when we talk about the space-time matrix, there is a sense that all time, past, present, and future, can be viewed as part of one system and existing in the present in some sense. this seems to be what you're getting at a little bit.
Yes, although it makes a difference if you think that the past, present and future are equally present, which is the conventional view of physics, which has the laws as transcendent and in some sense independent of time. Or if you think what I'm suggesting, there's a fundamental asymmetry between the past, the present and the future, so that the past has an influence which is cumulative, which is different from the future. There's a real polarity in time on this view.
In other words, perhaps the past is fixed, whereas the future there are many possible windows that can open up into different futures.
To put it simply, yes. I mean, the past involves sort of actualities which can have causal influences through what I call morphic resonance on the present, as well as through straightforward physical causes like motion, collisions, and so forth. But the future is not fixed in the same sense.
Well, you use the term morphic resonance or morphic fields or morphogenetic fields to explain many of the mysteries of life, ranging from the way in which various organisms take their shapes, to the way in which crystals are formed in a laboratory, or to the way in which rats can learn how to run through mazes, or the way in which people learn language. These things include well, they range from functional characteristics to structural characteristics, and I think it seems to be a very all-embracing concept, therefore, the way you use it.
Well, I think I mean, in a sense, it's perhaps a disadvantage to have such an all-embracing concept, because it sounds as if one's trying to push everything into a single idea. But on the other hand, we do have a deep sense, at least in our culture and tradition, of the unity of nature. And the present world view of science is an all-embracing concept, the mechanistic theory, and it's believed that that will explain all forms of structure, all functions, all patterns of behavior, and so forth, including human memory. And so, in a sense, if one's going to have an alternative world view, it doesn't make much sense to have an alternative worldview that's patchy, that just has an alternative here, because that means the regular mechanistic one would still remain in force, as it were, in all the other areas.
Well, I suppose if you're dealing with a concept as basic as the notion of time, as basic as the notion of the past, that everything is touched by the past, whether it's a subatomic particle or an organism or a rock.
Exactly. I mean, the nature of time and the influence of the past is so fundamental, you can hardly imagine anything that this wouldn't affect, as you say.
The notion that you bring up, though, the morphic fields, implies that you're suggesting as if the past itself is a field.
Not that the past is a field, but that fields have been there in the past, and the fields that exist in the present, the fields that organize animals, plants, you, me, the fields that organize the activity of my nervous system as I speak. These organizing fields have a past, as it were, and that the structure and form of the fields, their pattern of activity, depends on what happened in the past.
I think you take a bolder leap than that, don't you? I mean, you suggest that these morphic fields can reach across time and space in a way that, say, electromagnetic fields could never do.
Oh yes, I mean that's part of the theory, that the idea of morphic resonance is that similar things can influence subsequent similar things, and the influence depends on similarity, hence the metaphor of resonance, and it depends on similarity of form, pattern or structure, hence the word morphic from the Greek word form. And so the idea is of a kind of action at a distance, of like upon like, through or across time and space.
Well, that's a very bold hypothesis in the sense that, to my understanding, there's almost nothing, say, in conventional physics that can account for that.
Well, it's a hypothesis that simply hasn't been entertained in Western science, because I think of the extremely strong power of the idea that everything's governed by these eternal verities, which are not just acting from the past to the present, but are so powerful and so eternal, they permeate the whole of time, past, present and future, equally. There's no need for a memory in a world in which past, present and future are totally present, as it were. So, in a sense, this is a less metaphysical view than the conventional one. I'm only postulating this influence from the past. So it may seem bold, but it's when you consider what it's compared with, the postulate that we have at present is even bolder.
I guess what you're saying then, Rupert, is that if we look at conventional science, even though conventional scientists would hate to admit it, their worldview is strongly based on metaphysical assumptions. And if we're going to look at metaphysical assumptions, why don't we look at a few other alternative options?
Exactly. You put it very clearly, that there's no question whatsoever that the present worldview of science is strongly rooted in metaphysical assumptions. And as I show in my book, The Presence of the Past, the history of the subject makes this extremely clear. Most scientists have become unaware of this because these established patterns of thought have become habitual and largely unconscious. But if we're going to challenge them, we have to bring them to consciousness, and we have to realize that it's not that we've got one set of theories which are metaphysical and strange against hard, down-to-earth, hard-nosed empirical science, but the ordinary scientific view has a tremendous number of assumptions, and we have to become conscious of them if we're to see the power they have over our thinking. Otherwise, we're their slaves.
Yeah. Now, around the turn of the century, in Western culture, this theosophical movement had great influence in introducing Oriental ideas, Asian ideas into Western thinking. And one of the notions that the Theosophists, I believe, introduced is called the Akashic Records. The idea that in a certain state of consciousness, one can look into the past and see everything that was there. And the Theosophists wrote bold treatises on the evolution of life and on the development of the different kingdoms of nature. And I wonder if your work was at all influenced by some of that thinking.
Well, the idea of a causal influence through time, the basis of my hypothesis, I thought up when I was still teaching in Cambridge and before I went to live in India. I found through living in India that the idea of causal connections through time wasn't so outrageous. I mean, Indians take these things for granted. It's part of the Hindu theory of causation. And of course, so it is in the Buddhist world. And the Theosophists generalized, I think, a particular school of Mahayana Buddhist thought to get the idea of the Akashic records, which are indeed the idea of a kind of cosmic memory. As I understand the doctrine of the Akashic records, it's the idea that the whole of the past is in some sense remembered. I think the term Akashic record is unfortunate. Akasha's all right, that means space. And it's to do with something to do with space, the container of all things. But the idea record, to most people, would suggest either a gramophone record or a tape recording, or more in the context of theosophy generated in India, large numbers of dusty ledgers with records of what's gone on in yellowing ink. And I think this idea that the Akashic records are sort of physically stored as records in that way is an unfortunate metaphor. But certainly the idea of a kind of cosmic memory is similar to what I'm saying.
In other words, the notion of the morphic field and in some vision or some version of the Akashic records might be quite compatible.
They're compatible insofar as they're both ideas of a kind of ongoing memory in nature. I'm not quite sure how most theosophists would interpret the Akashic records nowadays, and I've never heard a very clear working out of that view.
Well, I remember, many years ago, I heard a 14-year-old guru called Guru Maharaji, who many of his followers worshipped as God at the time. It was a fad, short-lived, but he attracted a lot of attention. And he gave a talk, and during his talk he asked for questions, but he said, don't ask me any stupid questions. He said, like, where did yesterday go? And that dawned on me. I said, well, gee, that's not a stupid question, really. It almost seems to be what you're getting at. You know, where did yesterday go? It seems to me that you seem to be suggesting that yesterday is very much alive, and it's not just stored in our brains either, that somehow the influence of the past, am I pushing too far if I were to say that yesterday, our memory of yesterday somehow is yesterday, is where yesterday is?
Well, I wouldn't place it somewhere out there, you see. The way I think of it myself is not that the past is somehow stored away in some celestial ledger system,
Yeah.
or even in another dimension full of dimensional filing cabinets or something like that, but rather that our way of thinking about time in spatial metaphors may be inappropriate. We, both in science and in ordinary language, tend to think of time as if it's a spatial dimension, the distant past, the near future. And if we think of it that way, then yesterday would be there, and the day before yesterday would be there, and we'd think of them as a kind of linear sequence of days, somehow stacked
Right, like
up.
a long snake or something reaching back.
Yes. But I think that instead of the long snake, it's better to think of them as it were, concertinaed up against the present, so that the whole of the past is potentially present now. And it doesn't have to be stored anywhere. It's there if it can be tuned into or accessed. Just like this room's full of TV and radio transmissions, they're all occupying the same space. They're not getting in each other's ways or colliding with each other. But we don't know about them until we have a tuner that can access them and tune into them. So yesterday is potentially present now, and it's only when something similar enough happens that we access it.
And it's the morphic field which represents that compressed concertina then, that presence of the past brushing up against us, as it were.
Yes, through the process of what I call morphic resonance, all similar things in the past become, as it were, incorporated and present within the morphic field now.
And as a human being, I would be particularly resonant to the morphic fields of Homo sapiens, of other human beings.
Yes, I mean the morphic field you'd be most resonant with in the past is your own, since you'd
My own personal.
resonate specifically. You're more like you in the past than you are like me. And because of this high degree of specific similarity, you'd be specifically tuned to your own past, which is why I think you specifically have your own memories. And of course, you're similar to all other human beings to some extent, and therefore you and I would both, to some extent, tune into collective memories of large numbers of people. So our own memories would be accessed by morphic resonance from our own past against a large background of memories from many other people's past, which is similar to Jung's idea of the collective unconscious.
And I gather then that the same notion of the morphic resonance would explain why I might occasionally be able to tune into memories from your personal life or to exhibit other types of psychic phenomenon.
Possibly. I mean, if you tuned into my memories very recently, specifically, then it would be like telepathy. It would be telepathy.
Rupert, we're out of time. I'm going to have to cut the interview short now. Thank you so much for being with me.
A pleasure.
And thank you very much for being with us.